Hey everybody, it's me Ashish, and before we begin, I just want to give a quick thank you to everybody listening, watching, and supporting the podcast. It means the world to us, and we're so appreciative. I just want to let you guys know that you guys can always ask us questions, give us segment ideas, and keep up with the fun, all at AshishandFriends.com. We're on Twitter at AshishandPals, we're on Instagram at AshishandFriends, and hey, we're even on Facebook, facebook.com/AshishandFriendsPod. If you're watching this video, please go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to the channel. All that following and liking and subscribing will help us grow and keep going, so we appreciate it so much. And once again, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Yes, welcome to another great episode of the Ashish and Friends podcast. Today we're talking about something very important. We're going to start off talking about the legendary activist and former U.S. Representative John Lewis, and then we're going to move on discussing about something really important going on in our world today, and that is the Black Lives Matter discussion and the protests and everything going on. So we're going to move on to that. As always, I'm your host, Ashish. You can catch me on Instagram and on Twitter at AshishAri. Of course, I'm joined by my longtime friends and co-hosts. We've got Shahan at Shahan Jayaraja. We've got Dev at Superlaser, and we've got Ryan. So without further ado, I'm going to give it off to Shahan to talk about John Lewis.
Yeah, well, fun facts about me. I actually lived in John Lewis's district for a short period of time when I lived in Atlanta. And, so the thing about John Lewis, and a lot of people have kind of given him good tributes in the last couple of days, but John Lewis is best known for being the youngest speaker at the March on Washington. He was actually only 23 years old when he gave his speech on the same day as the I Have a Dream speech. And actually, something that I learned in the last couple of days too is that he actually had a speech that was so kind of fiery and almost a little over the top that people kind of made him tone it down a little. He was a real kind of radical back in the day. But he was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and became the youngest speaker at the March on Washington. 2 years later, what he's perhaps best known for, in addition to that, was he was part of the Selma March, the Voting Rights March, and the first time they actually tried that march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he was actually beaten by police, actually had his skull broken, and then was arrested. And later he ended up obviously living. He was the oldest living, was the last surviving member of the March on Washington to give a speech. Died this week at the age of 80, but also was a longtime representative in the U.S. House of Representatives from Atlanta, was a universally liked figure, and a really important congressman as well after the fact. So, I think he's one of the greatest Americans to ever live in a lot of ways, and I think that obviously his loss is such a great one for both the United States and also our government.
For sure. I mean, I think just his passing at this time when we're, a lot of people are trying to be activists and trying to, get back into that where we can have these discussions. And I think it's just the timing is crazy because he did so much in his life, and he's definitely a legendary character. Ryan, did you want to add anything about John Lewis?
He's been fighting, his whole life for civil rights and for the equality of African Americans in our country, and it shows the dedication that he has. Because to the day he died, he was still in the Senate, and he was still, giving the speeches as Shahan mentioned, and really pushing for that. And I just wanted to mention when he fractured his skull, he was so smiling because he knew what he was fighting for and what he did was right. And I think it shows that if you keep having courage and pushing and being vocal, that you're going to push the issue until there's a resolution. And that's something that we have to do as well when we're fighting this movement that we're in as well.
Yeah, and one thing I want to mention that when I was reading up on him today, I didn't know was that he was organizing sit-ins while a college student.
Yeah.
And so you can be an activist at almost any age, and he really goes to show that. So I really admired that about him. Another fun fact that I guess not fun fact that I had read about him was that he was arrested 46 times, which really goes to show you that arrests or laws may not necessarily align with morals, and sometimes you have an obligation to do what's right, even if it's against the law.
Yeah, and the thing that I think is always going to get me is he was actually arrested 5 times as a sitting congressman, right? So like after he had already been elected, after he already was a known leader, 5 cops decided that that they wanted to fuck around and try to arrest John Lewis. They just wanted to keep adding to his total. So this is a guy who was willing to do what was right, and like Dev said, I mean, you see people getting arrested today. You see people getting thrown in jail. You see this insane secret police that's going around and throwing people in vans. Like, this is our heritage, right? This is what we're asked to do. And when we look back at these people and this moment in history, we're going to remember people who were arrested not as people who were criminals, but as people who fought for justice.
That is totally true. And it's crazy, just like growing up during his time, he had to fight that. And that's something we're still trying to be activists about, right? We're trying to have this discussion about equality, and it's still going on today. And that was ridiculous. I had no idea that he did get arrested as a Congress member. I think that's wild, right? Yeah. And another little, I guess, a little bonus thing is he was on an episode of Arthur, which is one of the great shows of all time. Just look up on Google and learn more about John Lewis and what he stood for. And I think it's very important, especially during these times now.
That's really right cool. Now, I didn't know about the Arthur episode. I'm definitely going to have to go watch that after this.
It's a good one. It's a good one.
All right. So right now we're going to transition into something exactly what we're talking about, right? Fighting for equality. So this started May 25th when George Floyd passed away, right? He got killed. He was murdered. And ever since then, over these past few weeks and months, we've seen people have protests. We've had people fight against those protests too, right? So let's just talk about Black Lives Matter. Shahan, what does that mean to you? What's going on?
I just want to give a little clarification. This has been going on for a long time. It's just become a lot more mainstream, and that was one of the catalysts. So
right. So this is like never been like non-issue, right? Like it's always been an issue. It just finally, everyone finally tried to put their voice out and try to stand up at least once, right? Like what happens is I think a lot of athletes and celebrities, unfortunately, they do like put a tweet out saying, "Oh, this is wrong that this happened," right? This happened like all the time. Every couple of weeks you hear something, right? But then like no one takes action after that. So if we're like, okay, this is it. Like we're sick of it. It keeps on happening. Nothing's being changed. And finally we see like so many protests, so many people being vocal about this. Thanks for correcting me on that, Dev. Didn't want to leave that out. All right, so Sean.
And I think so the Black Lives Matter protest has been something that's really dated back to about 2014 or 2015. It really sort of started in earnest with the Trayvon Martin killing, but it really became sort of a movement after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And when I look at this time in history, I think it's easy to look at this and be like, George Floyd's killing was obviously horrific, but why was this the catalyst? Why was this the moment? And it's kind of funny, right? Because I think that we're at such a critical moment in history because, first of all, you have so many people out of work. You have so many people that are being wronged in so many ways right now and being let down by police, by the government. And we've all been cooped up so much in our houses. We've had nothing to do except for think and talk and have these conversations. And look, when that killing happened, along with, Ahmaud Arbery is another one earlier this year that I think really contributed to that. Breonna Taylor is another one that happened in the days after that. When you have these 3 events happen, while we're all in our houses, while we're all trying to process what's going on in the world, I think that it made for one of these moments that you look at world history, right? There are always multiple things that come together to create a moment like this. And I think that you look at what's happened in 2020, we've had all those things come together. And what this is really about, right? This is about structural racism. This is racism that has been baked into the history of our country, right? And you look at policing, which is obviously one of the big things that people talk about. Like policing in America came from a heritage of catching slaves. That's how policing started in America. And so when you talk about these issues that we're dealing with today, especially relating to policing, these are things that are baked into the history of our country, and that's what makes them so critical and difficult to solve.
And I think when we talk about what kind of made that George Floyd tragedy such a moment for everyone, I think one of the major things that stuck out to me was seeing and hearing all of the onlookers and civilians begging the cops to save George Floyd's life, right? And it really becomes an interesting situation when you're watching a video and civilians who aren't trained, they don't know the whole situation, but they're like pleading from a moral standpoint. Like these people like the cops should be held to a higher standard than a civilian, right? And it's crazy watching civilians know what's right and wrong and seeing cops do nothing.
Totally true. And I think when you just look at it, it's crazy how, I mean, it's amazing how these past few years people have their phones, right? They can take pictures or videos. Like, just imagine the incidents that don't get reported, right? That didn't get caught, especially during the times when we didn't have our cell phones, right? Like, this has been going on for such a long time. It's disgusting. Ryan, I just want to throw it to you if you want to talk about this real quick.
Well, that's a good point, because I've noticed now too, a lot of those incidents that may have been missed are being brought up because of this movement that's occurring, and I think that's very profound to bring those up and look and show there's so many examples that have been lost that need to be acknowledged. And Shahan makes a great point and Dev makes a great point that this movement has been going on a lot longer than just this moment of time. And I think that obviously the Black Lives Movement itself has been 2014, but I think the fight for equality of all individuals has been going on for decades, if not centuries, for this population. And I think that's an important thing to note, is that this is just another movement in that fight.
And I really like what you and Ryan were saying there about the cell phones and the video recordings. And it kind of speaks to a larger point that when people and communities tell us stuff, we need to listen. And like, because black communities have been telling us that they've been getting a raw end of the deal for years, well before cell phones, and we just didn't believe them, right? And now that we can capture these moments, everyone sees it. So it's really important that when the community speaks out against something, we really need to listen and understand where they're coming from, because it's real.
Well, and I think one thing, that I think is very important to note is that, when we say Black Lives Matter, and I mean, I think that a lot of people who listen to this podcast probably kind of understand this, but, what we're talking about is not that, is not civilians versus civilians, right? Like when we're talking about police violence, the reason that it's so critical is because these people have power that we don't have. This people kind of bring up like black on black crime, whatever, and the reason that those aren't the same things is because black on black crime is just crime, right? Like that's just crime. That's interpersonal crime. What happens when people commit crimes, then law enforcement comes and deals with it, right? It's different if the people who enforce the law are also unjust. And so, and just to take this to another, in a little bit of a different direction too, one thing for us, we are 4 South Asian men on this podcast, right? And we're 4 South Asian people who have all tried to be very involved in this movement and be involved. But, I think that one thing that I read was such a good example of kind of what Asian American roles are in this, right? So the George Floyd killing, the guy whose knee was on his neck, obviously a white guy, right? The store that called the cops on George Floyd was apparently an Asian American store. Like I think that it was like a Persian store or something like that. And on top of that, you see obviously the picture of, the white cop Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd. Who's standing right in front of it? It's an Asian American cop just kind of standing there and not intervening, right? And I think that when you look at sort of the history of modern America when it comes to issues of race, especially when it comes to issues of black people, Asian Americans have kind of felt okay being bystanders and not necessarily being the oppressors, but not necessarily jumping in because they don't want to be targeted too. And I think that we need to have conversations like this because I think that we need to know that this has to stop. We can't just be bystanders anymore. We have to be active participants.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, Shahan. Just quickly, like when we all did the social media thing of blacking out, right? That it's blackout, nothing on social media. I think that was like a nice step to show that so many people do care. But I think that's just one step, right? Like we can't just stop there. Like Shahan mentioned, we do have to have discussions. We do need to like educate ourselves, educate other people, and do what we can, whether it's like vocalizing, whether it's donating money, whether it's like volunteering or time. We definitely need to take action and not just like do one thing. It's great. It was a nice like showing, right? But it definitely can't stop there, right? And I'll throw it to Dev or Ryan to add in what you like.
So one thing Shahan mentioned too with the Asian community and us being bystanders, I think it's very unfair for us to be bystanders, considering, especially within the four of us, how much we consume Black culture, and we're influenced by this culture. I mean, all of us love hip hop. We all love basketball. We all love, like, I'm a big streetwear fan. I love these things, and this culture that's so important to me, I should also be standing up for it.
And one thing, well, Ryan, actually, do you want to?
I was just gonna go back on a point Dev made earlier. I think one of the most important things to do to solve any problem, but really a situation like this, is to listen, because as listen and to learn, because as people coming from a different background, we may not understand what they go through on a daily basis, the things that they endure, and until we understand that, it's hard to come up with a solution to fix that problem. And so I think that's a great point that Dev made, is that sometimes you don't realize the hardships they do on a daily basis. And then the second thing that you mentioned that I like too is the culture, the fact that the world became better with the culture and the things that are brought by not only by African Americans, but every different culture in this world. And if we don't treat them the way they deserve, then how can we use their culture? How can we take that for granted? So we all deserve the same equity and the same respect, and we can't take that for granted.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? We're all human beings trying to survive, and um, really, I think that a lot of times with the divisiveness in this country, and a lot of times with the terminology, you kind of get distance from that. They try to keep you distance from realizing that we're all human beings that that are trying to survive. We're just people.
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to ask you guys about is, I think that one way that the Asian community sort of perpetuates this, and one way that I think that I've seen that we've tried to deal with it is we don't have these conversations with our family. I think that, like, the four of us here, I don't think that this is a new thing that all of us are trying to be more involved in standing up for Black lives, but what conversations have you guys had with your family, and how receptive have kind of people been? And what have you guys exactly talked about too?
This is something that's really interesting because it's a change that my family's had. So, so for those, I mean, you guys probably know, but some of the viewers might not know. My family and I've had our ups and downs as a relationship, and over the past few years, we've gotten a lot closer. And especially with this George Floyd event, I've really been talking to my mom a lot about this, and for the first time in her life, I think it's made a real change on her viewpoint. Because I think when you like, especially for her being an immigrant coming in and being college educated by the time she already got to the U.S., she views like, you tend to view through like a very specific lens. And I think that this was the first time where through these conversations we are able to um, kind of give them a different way of looking at the world, and why people are saying that this is a problem even though you don't see it. And I had made a Facebook post about how I had experienced racism in my life, and I got a lot of positive feedback on that post from a lot of parents, because a lot of parents had never looked at it through that perspective. And so I really think that sharing our own perspectives in our own lives, like with our family, with our friends, through social media or just through personal conversations, phone calls, all of that makes this a lot easier to deal with, a lot easier to come to solutions, and a lot easier. It's less stressful. You're going to live a happier life.
That's totally true. And like for me, every time something like this happened, me and my mom used to watch the news together, right? So this is something we had an open discussion about, and discussing with my brother and my dad. It's just their views haven't changed because they were already like, this is disgusting, right? We talked about like what we can do, what are some steps we can actually take, right? Instead of just like discussing between ourselves, well, like who else can we inform? Because I think me and Shahan have talked about this in person. somehow in the Indian culture, right? For a lot of Indians that come here or whatever, they look down, right? The darker the skin, the less beautiful you are, right? Or so something like that. We've
Yeah.
talked about a product. It's called Fair and Lovely, where they're promoting to look brighter and look better, right? Because if you look brighter, then that's beautiful, right? But if you look dark, then that's ugly. And I think that's really messed up. Fortunately, my family hasn't been that way, but I've seen other people, unfortunately, that I've known, but they come over, right, and kind of like they're really stubborn about these thoughts, and the way they judge people is really disgusting. I've tried talking to people. If not, I've tried cutting them off, because no offense, I don't see the point of maintaining relationships where people are being racist, right? Like you have to do your best to try to be active about it and be vocal about it, but it's really disgusting, and something I've seen a lot in the Indian culture, where parents see the lighter skin being beautiful, dark skin, especially like the southern India, right? Like there's that view of like, oh, we're nice and bright and that's beautiful, and it's disgusting. And you can see by the products or like the actual industry, right, of the movie industries, they prefer the whiter, brighter skinned people. And I think that's something as a whole for India and probably South Asians in general, something we can talk about for sure. Because especially when you talk about America, you're thinking about like a melting pot, right? Oh, what makes this country so great is it's the land of opportunity. You've got all these cultures and backgrounds, but that doesn't matter when people of power and authority are putting down people of color, right? That's just super wrong. And I'll try to pass it on. Sorry, I know it's taking a long time there.
Sorry, I know I've been talking a lot, but I do want to just comment really quickly on one thing you mentioned. I was the same way. I liked cutting these people out of my life because they had this toxic energy. And recently I had a little bit of a change of heart, especially when it comes to like quote unquote Facebook debates or just any online forum, which is that you may not change the mind of the person that you're talking to, but you don't know who could be reading this. And you could be helping out a lot of people who are just reading it as a bystander. So I think it's really interesting that obviously I'm not saying like be openly hateful or engage with people who are being openly hateful to you. But what I'm saying is that sometimes through having these conversations in a public manner, we can really make a change because it's not just the person you're talking to that you're affecting.
Right. And for me, it was like people I actually talked to like face to face. And I
Yeah.
was just like, what I did was, I tried to point out like how wrong it was, right? Then I discussed other people with similar backgrounds, and I was just trying to get a feedback. Like, this is kind of what they grew up with, right? Like, it's very messed up, but it is what they grew up with, and we need to find a way to kind of get rid of that narrative. Ryan, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, Deb, and I like the point you make too, Ashish and Deb, is that sometimes we have things that have been put in our cultures or just the way we grew up or the way we live that may not be the best course of action, the best beliefs or morals. And I think it's very important to reflect on the way we act and the things we do in our daily lives to see how it affects other people and things we can improve. Because I think the biggest thing we can do in a movement like this is to make sure that our actions align with the words that we speak and the movement that we're involved with. So I think reflecting on that and reflecting on our culture and our belief system, and that is very important. And to go back on Shahan's question, to answer your question, I spoke with my parents about this because I'm probably all know I'm part of Baha'i faith, and it's been a big topic of discussion in our religion in terms of what we can do as people and as a religious community and in our communities to help with this movement in terms of unifying people and getting activities to discuss this and to bring people together. And I think that opened up the conversation with my parents because they're trying to figure out in their communities how to figure this out and to reflect on how they've been acting towards these people from different cultures and backgrounds, and especially the African American community. And I think it's a beautiful thing to bring up these conversations because it does lead to reflections on yourself and leads to action. So I think it's a very powerful moment of time we're in.
Yeah, and one thing, that I'll say is that it's funny that, I think that one thing that I can address is an elephant in the room, that I'm the only dark-skinned person, out of this group, right? And it's funny that you guys kind of mentioned that, like Ashish, you had said, like, that colorism hasn't necessarily come up with you guys. Well, like, it definitely has in my family, right? and my family is a very progressive family. My family's been out of Sri Lanka for quite a while, but like, it's not that it's necessarily people being like, oh, we're gonna talk about this, but it's little comments, it's little like, oh, well, maybe you could do this, oh, maybe, stuff like that, right? Because, like, I mean, one of my relatives who I'm very, very close with, they have lighter skin, and that's something that they hold almost as a point of pride for themselves, even though obviously the rest of our family is more on the dark side. And the other thing that I want to kind of bring up is that I think that a lot of people, and this is both white and Asian people, right? There are definitely people who, especially in the Asian community, are pretty open about the fact that they look down on Black people, right? Like, there are definitely those times that you hear people talk about it and they really don't make a secret about it. But I think that the one thing that people sort of overlook, and generally in American culture, is that it doesn't take being overtly racist to have a negative impact on Black people, right? So, we talk about things like, you don't have to join the Klan, right? You don't have to, do whatever thing. I think that actually one of the most interesting cases to come out during this whole situation was the Amy Cooper case, right? Because this is for people who don't know, this is a white, well-educated, high-earning person who lives in New York and obviously lives in one of the most diverse cities on the planet, right? Like somebody who is very used to being around minorities. And then what happened was this African-American man who was a bird watcher, who, funnily enough, his last name was Cooper too, Christian Cooper. He came up because she didn't have a dog on her leash. And when there's sort of dogs roaming around, it makes bird watching a lot harder because they scare off all the birds, right? So he comes up and, I mean, forcefully is kind of like, hey, you need to have your dog on the leash. And she threatens to call the police and then does, and pretends that there's like a dangerous situation happening so that they'll come and basically to try to scare him away. So what that means is that this person who, donated to democratic causes and all that, who lives in the most liberal city in America, as soon as she's reduced to her base desire, that's what happens. She knows the power that she holds over this Black man through the form of the police. And I think that that's something that, when we are just going about normal life, we do things as individuals and as a society that perpetuates that system. And, I think that that's one of the hardest things for people to sort of understand, is that you don't have to be doing something malicious to still be doing something that perpetuates racism. And for us, again, in the brown community, that is colorism, right? That is casteism even. It's things like that where you are finding reasons to elevate yourself at the expense of others, whether it's something that societally already exists, whether it's something that you are adding to the conversation. I mean, even, one thing for me, I put out a thread on it on Twitter. For us, we all went to Coppell High School together, right? Well, there's a whole bunch of the city of Irving that was districted to Coppell, and it was vast majority South Asian people. And you look at the way that the district lines were drawn too, it explicitly left out many Black and Hispanic people, right? That's something that, our parents didn't ask for that, but they were, they were okay with it. That's part of why they moved to the district, was because it would be quote unquote better, quote unquote low levels of at-risk students. That's the sort of stuff that we have to think about and that we have to look for. And it asks us to make changes in our day-to-day lives and in how we make decisions for ourselves.
And some of these actions we take, like Shohan was mentioning, that it's the little things that can perpetuate this notion of racism. And I think part of it sometimes is our unconscious bias, the things that we grew up with, like Ashish mentioned, like the caste system and all those things can lead to this unconscious bias that we act in a way that we don't realize is hurtful or perpetuating what's going on right now. And I think that's something we need to be mindful and reflect, as I mentioned earlier, reflect in ourselves and understand and listen to realize and make sure that our actions are aligning with our words and with the movement at hand.
Yeah, and I was having a conversation with somebody else actually about how we teach history, right? Because we obviously, history is taught from the perspective of the victors, right? That's just reality. Well, now, it's a very good thing that now we're starting to come to terms with that. But like, we have to think back, right? When we think of, how the way that like the Constitution and the Founding Fathers are taught, for example, right? I think that's a good example. We think about it from the perspective of, well, these white Southerners came in and they sort of tried to manipulate things to try to bring power to the South, right? We were taught that it's about them trying to rally for economic power, right, to the South. And that's true. That's absolutely true, right? The reason that they made these decisions at the Constitutional Convention was to try to protect the economic interests of the South. But what we don't necessarily talk about enough, and we say it, but we don't talk about it enough, is that what we are doing is the people who rallied for economic support for the South were trying to perpetuate atrocities in order to protect the economic interests of the South, right? We only tell it from the perspective of the Congress people who are there, from the people at the Constitutional Convention. We don't tell it from the perspective of the people who were on the ground there. We don't tell it from the perspective of these are the things that we were willing to give up in order to have economic power. Those are the sort of things we need to talk about. And one thing, too, that we don't talk about enough is that you look at the global state of slavery when this country was founded, slavery was starting to head out, right? Like within the next 30 years, France got rid of slavery. When you look in the next 50 years, the UK got rid of slavery. I think it was 1817 or something like that the UK decided to abolish slavery in the colonies, and the US took until 1865. Like, we were behind the curve on that issue, and that's something that I think we need to grapple with and come to terms with.
And the founding fathers, like it's talked about, a lot of them knew it was immoral at the time, right?
John Adams was very explicitly like, we can't have a free country unless everybody is free. This was not a foreign opinion to them. They knew what they were doing.
Right. Well, I think this is really important. I'm really glad we had this conversation. So I think what's next is like, what we do about it, right? So we talked about talking about with our families. I think that's the first step. Obviously, just have open discussions, then talk to your friends about it. I think one of the most best things right now that I'm seeing is like on Instagram, I still have some friends that keep posting stories daily about informational graphics, trying to educate everybody about this and keeping everyone up to date. And I think that's amazing that we need to keep having these conversations, trying to educate people and do the best we can. Another thing is donating. I know he's not going to toot his own horn, but I know Shahan actually matched a large number of donations, and I think doing something like that is a really great act, and it gets people involved and it keeps things going, right? We don't want this momentum to stop, right? I think that's the number one thing. And another thing I've heard is a lot of people coming back against this, right? I think that's the crazy part is you see all these protesters doing this great work, then you have people online, right, being like, oh, this is stupid, keep sports as sports, don't bring politics in this. And it's kind of just shining a light on how important this is and how other people actually feel about this, right? You don't see it until you see these comments and you're like, what is going on here? And I heard a lot of people complaining about the rioting that was happening. And I agree, rioting is not great, right? We should keep to the peaceful protest. But you know what's worse than rioting? Cold-blooded murder. So if you have any other thoughts of how we can, what are the future steps that we can take, obviously talking to the community, Shahan, Dev, Ryan, if you have anything you want to add in of steps we can take as to keep this going forward.
Yeah, in addition to what you said, Ashish, I think one of the biggest things we can do is what we mentioned earlier in the podcast is when we see something wrong, when we see something unjust, that we don't just let it pass by, that we act upon it, that we be vocal about it and have an action towards that to get it resolved, to get a solution, and not let those things pass by. And then obviously respecting every individual in our way, irrespective of their gender, sexual orientation, color of their skin, as a person, as an individual, and looking through their soul and trying to unify everybody as one humankind, because that's the only way that this world will progress to what it can be.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the things I'm trying to do better is, when we think of politics, a lot of the time we think of the president, right? Like we get so bogged down with like, it's this guy, it's this guy. If we elect this guy, it's gonna solve everything. Like it's not. That's not how this works. That's not how this country's ever worked. That's not how this country's designed to work, right? Like we could elect Jesus Christ as president, and guess what? It wouldn't suddenly solve everything. That's just not how this works. So one thing that I'm trying to be better about is I'm trying to be better about being responsible for my own community, right? So we need to all be accountable for the community that we're in. And part of that is going out and voting, right? And so for us, I know that for a lot of us, we're in a congressional district that has a chance to change. You know, we're in a congressional district where we have a chance to elect somebody who recognizes these issues and represents those interests. That's something that we need to do. We need to do that at the Texas Senate and Texas House level, too. We need to do that in our city councils. We need to do that with our police chiefs. We need to do that with our sheriffs. These are all things that we have the ability to vote for that we kind of take for granted because we're so distracted by presidential politics, right? The reality is that our communities won't change because of presidential politics. They're going to change because we are holding people accountable on our level. And that includes writing to your representative. That includes writing to your city councilman. That includes calling their office. That includes telling people what we want and what's not acceptable to us anymore. You know, again, when I look back and I had John Lewis as my representative, I kind of have to step back and realize this is something I should be demanding of every single representative that I have at any level. I should want all of them to be held to the same standard that we held John Lewis. And the other things, too, that I think that we can do, like Ryan said, we need to step up and have these conversations with our family. We need to counter people who say things that aren't correct. Because the other thing, too, about this is that even if you're not changing their mind, if somebody says something that's offensive and we just let it slide, you are telling everybody else who's in the room that it's okay. And you're also telling them that their opinion is not something that deserves to be countered. If we are here and we believe what we believe, we need to stand up for it every single moment of the day. We can't just do it when we're in this setting among friends. And like Ashish said, donating is a big thing. Try to find local organizations to donate to as well. Things that are in this state of Texas, in the city of Dallas, in the city of Irving or Coppell or wherever. Again, try to make this local. Try to affect your own community. And I think that that's really the best thing that we can do.
Yeah, man, I really wish I'd talked before Shahan because he kind of killed it. So I will say just two quick things that I think you can do just at home today. Anyone can do to educate themselves on this. I would say the first thing is Jane Elliott has an experiment called the Brown and Blue Eyes experiment. Please just look it up on YouTube and watch it and just try to understand the perspective that she's trying to show here. Just stop and put yourself in the shoes of growing up under systemic racism for 30 minutes. And I think it's a very powerful experience and something that everyone should do. The other thing that I would say is there's a small book, it's 100 pages, it's called On Tyranny. And it just talks about the different tyrannical things that had happened within just the 20th century. So this is current history, basically. What is currently affecting us today, and I highly recommend it. And you can learn and see parallels in our current society if you pay attention. So I really recommend this book. It's called On Tyranny. I would check that out as well.
Yeah, and actually, just real quick, there are a couple other books I'd recommend. Just Mercy is a fantastic book. It's about the prison system and kind of how we handle death row inmates. The New Jim Crow is another really great book. It talks a lot about sort of what the war on drugs is and how it led to an era of mass incarceration. So, and then the other one that I haven't personally read that I've heard from my sister especially that you need to read is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. It's supposed to be a phenomenal book, and it really gets into the details of what is our responsibility on a daily basis to try and fight racism.
All right, really great stuff. Obviously, Shahan and Dev gave you some examples of things you can read and check out. Of course, there's multiple different things you can check out, but we'll try to discuss them more and try to promote them as well. Well, this is a different episode. One thing we want to do with this podcast, we do want to have fun and be entertaining. At the same time, there are some serious discussions we want to have. We do want to take great action in this world and try to leave a better place than it is right now. And if you want to have any discussions about this, you can always hit us up individually or as a group. If there's anything that you think we need to talk about, please let us know for sure. But I think with this podcast, we want to be informative, have discussion, at the same time, try to take action and do good in the world. I think that wraps up another great episode of the Ashish and Friends podcast. Until next time, see ya.